All right, welcome everybody to Real Crusades History. This is going to be our live stream about the fall of Constantinople in 1453. And this one's probably been a long time coming. I know we've certainly had a lot of requests for it over the years. And so here it is. We're now going to be discussing this all-important event, which I guess, some people almost look at this as the event that sort of marks the transition from the medieval world to the modern world. But, we'll talk about that a little bit as we get going here. So let me go ahead and welcome our panel for the evening. As usual, Rand Brown will be joining me. Rand, welcome. Thanks for being here, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. And also our special guest for the evening is going to be Joe Vicinanzo. Now, some of you may remember Joe from back when he joined us on the Fourth Crusade podcast series, the now epic and famous Fourth Crusade podcast series. So Joe is kind of our special guest on that one. And he's going to be here with us to talk about the fall of Constantinople. So Joe, thanks for being here. How are you?
Yeah, doing really well.
All right, glad to have you back. And, Joe has kind of a lifelong interest in the study of all things Byzantine. So Joe really is a good person to have on for this particular topic. And I know last time when we did the Fourth Crusade, Joe actually mentioned that this is a topic he'd be interested in tackling. So we're glad to have you here, Joe.
For sure.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so the fall of Constantinople, 1453. So just to kind of start us off here, I thought we could discuss the Ottoman Empire to some extent, since that's kind of the triggering entity here that really makes all of this possible.
Pretty essential.
Yeah, since they're the ones who actually conquered Constantinople. And also it's kind of interesting because the Ottomans had been growing up and kind of coming, into their own over the course of the last, decades. Really since, I guess, we're talking about the beginning of the 14th century is when the Ottomans really get going, but then they really kind of start to become a major power fairly recently, as we're getting close to 1453.
I'd say it had been within 100 years. Certainly, right after I'd say that the balance of power between the Byzantines and the Ottomans in the area shifted sometime shortly after the Black Death.
Okay. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you now, Joe. Just let you give a little introduction to the Ottomans at this period. What do you think? What's the state of the Ottoman Empire on the eve of 1453?
Well, they were pretty strong. They were certainly the strongest power in the region. They may have been the strongest power in the Western world. France probably could have given them a pretty good run for their money. But there's no Christian power or Muslim power anywhere nearby that could rival the Ottomans in their organization or just the sheer size of their military. The Ottomans, if you want a little background, they came about sometime around the turn of the 1300s, the late 1200s, early 1300s, founded by a semi-legendary figure, Osman, after whom the Ottomans are named. They're, of course, Turks. This is a group of Turks. They kind of arose in the area that had been the dominant of the Seljuk Turks, a previous dynasty. In the area that the Turks themselves referred to as Rum or Rome, so in central Anatolia. So in this central Anatolia or Asia Minor area that had been traditionally Roman, Greek, what we are probably going to be calling Byzantine for the most part. In that area, they considered themselves to be in some way a successor state to the Roman Empire, and they were certainly saw themselves as conquering the Romans, conquering this land that belonged to the Romans, and then actually trying to adopt some of the customs and certainly the kind of the pedigree of the Romans that they replaced. So they saw this as, in a number of ways, as not just a military conquest, but kind of coming into their own over the decades and the centuries, becoming an established power, inheriting this legacy that went back to the ancient Romans. So beginning in the early 1300s, they were pretty substantial. Of course, the Byzantines, after reconstituting their state, retaking Constantinople from the Latins in the 1260s, They after that point, the Byzantines were certainly the most powerful state in the area for probably a century. But there was a lot of division. There were still some satellite kingdoms. The Empire of Trebizond was a Greek, a Roman state ruled by Komnenoi, in opposition to the established Byzantine dynasty in Constantinople, the Paleologi. And the Ottomans took advantage of the disunion of the Christians, the Greeks, the Latins, and the disunion of their other Muslim neighbors to carve out a very large state in Anatolia, in Turkey, what's now Turkey, named after them. And it was around the period of the mid 1350s and 1354 specifically, when the Ottomans crossed over at the invitation, unfortunately, of a Byzantine ruler in the midst of a civil war, crossed over the Dardanelles that separate Asia from Europe and ended up controlling the Gallipoli Peninsula. And from thence, in the next 50 years, basically, piece by piece, took apart the Byzantine Empire in the Balkans and became the dominant power not just in Asia Minor, in Anatolia, but the Balkans as well. So,
Joe, one question I have for you, and it's but something I kind of always felt, and this is a little bit outside my usual realm of study, but I always kind of saw the Ottoman Turks as being kind of a byproduct of the chaos and the power vacuum created by the Mongol expansion, the Mongol migrations in the mid to late 1200s. They were kind of one of those peoples that kind of got pushed west by that, and then kind of fell upon area, and regions, particularly Asia Minor, that was kind of a power vacuum at the time. Would that be a correct way of saying that?
Yeah, I think so to a certain extent. I don't know. The Asia Minor, they were dominant pretty quickly. They rose to prominence pretty quickly after the beginning of the 14th century. Certainly, the established Muslim empires, various caliphates in the region were hit very hard by the Mongols, and there was definitely a power vacuum in Asia following the Mongol invasions, and that I would say that probably did allow for the Ottomans to expand their holdings in Asia. Yes.
Okay.
Now, actually, speaking of conquerors, the Ottomans in the second half of the 14th century, second half of the 1300s, they expanded so rapidly and so quickly that there was a crusade organized against them in 1396. This Crusade of Nicopolis, which actually did bring it brought in English, French. It was led primarily by Burgundians and Hungarians, and that was
actually I do have to say, and unfortunately, it's a very common misconception. There actually was no English participation in that. That came from I know what you're talking about. That came from a source in the 19th century that misread some French names, and they assigned it to an English noble. They assigned it to one of the Beauforts, but actually the Beaufort that he thought they were talking about, they actually have actual English records that have him still in England during the Crusade of Nicopolis. So the English actually didn't. There was heavy French participation. To include Marshal Boucquet, who we would see again at Agincourt in 1415. But no, the English actually didn't participate in that.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, like I was saying though, they had become such a power that a crusade was organized against them, which ultimately failed. And they did besiege Constantinople and may have been able to take it around in the early 1400s, had not Timur the Lame, Timur the great Muslim, well, he was a Muslim, but Mongol successor of Turkic origin, come thundering into the region and dealt them a major setback that lasted for about 20 years. So definitely the pressure from steppe peoples did have something to do probably with the desire of the Ottomans to expand into Europe, where they would have some more protection from that constant bombardment.
Well, and something that was really interesting, I always found really interesting about the Crusade of Nicopolis, and you also have some minor campaigns fought throughout the mid to late 14th century by the Knights of St. John, the Knights Hospitaller out of Rhodes. But the interesting thing was you kind of see this shift of the attitude, the European attitude towards the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, however you want to call it. It's everybody always gets kind of real hung up on the Crusade, the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and the very brief existence of the Latin Empire and whatnot. And so there's kind of this idea that like, Western Europe and the Eastern Roman Empire were like, culturally at odds with one another. But really, once the Paleologoi come onto the scene, you really kind of see a very different attitude in Western Europe towards the Byzantine Empire and the Byzantine emperors. I was actually talking before we just started this podcast. I was actually talking about a very interesting story of how I can't remember which Paleologoi emperor it was. I think it was one of the Johns, possibly, but one of them actually visited, toured Western Europe in the very early 15th century, and made it all the way to England, where he was he met with King Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, and was hosted with very incredible fanfare, and all the English and French chroniclers of the time talk about how they were so honored that they were able to host him, and he was given all these promises of aid and aid against the Turks, and yes, we want to preserve you, we want to help you defend Constantinople, yada yada yada. Unfortunately, conflicts much closer to home, specifically the 100 Years' War, took the vast majority of the precedence over that. But what I thought was interesting is that you don't see that animosity anymore. You don't see that cultural animosity between East and West. While I'm sure there were those who were, still harbored some theological and some cultural points of disagreement. There definitely doesn't, the spirit of 1204 does not seem to be there anymore.
Yes, there was a lot more recognition of what they had in common. For one thing, though, during that period, Western Europe itself was riven by the Avignon papacy and the great papal schism. At one point in the early 1400s, you have three different people claiming to be pope. So maybe the fact that there was no one pope to unite around kind of helped to just be like, we're just all Christians. The figure of the pope did decrease in his importance during that period. So
okay, so that's some good background there, Joe. So I think you kind of covered both of those first two questions, the Ottoman Empire and the Byzantine Empire on the eve of 1453. But is there anything else you want to say about kind of the state the Byzantines were in at this point? I mean, you mentioned that the Ottomans had picked off a lot of their territory.
Oh, sure. I have a couple more things on the Ottomans just to just before we move on.
Sure.
The Ottomans did begin not just as a consciously attempting to be, succeeding to the legacy of the Roman Empire, but also they were Ghazis. That is to say that they were border warriors for the Islamic faith. They were not. They were explicitly. They're kind of maybe the Islamic equivalent of a kind of a crusader in the Crusader states. Kind of on the fringes of the Muslim world. Dar al-Islam. Engaged in warfare for the faith, for Islam against the infidel, and that was the way that the Ottomans in their early decades actually brought people in and got them to fight for them, and of course, promising booty and plunder and whatnot as recompense to pay them for their services. So they were explicitly their reason for being, their justification was to expand Islam. They were not like the old-fashioned, Arab states at the time who were just kind of content to rule over whoever happened to be in their territory. They were explicitly expansionist and Islamist.
Was that kind of an identity? I don't mean to interrupt, but that's kind of fascinating. Was that kind of an identity that the Ottomans maintained, Joe, like throughout their
very much so, right up until the end? In fact, we associate this crescent moon with a symbol of Islam. It's not actually a symbol of Islam. It's a symbol of the Ottoman Empire. It was originally a Turkic symbol from Asia, from Asia, Central Asian steppes that they had, and it wasn't until the Ottomans really became, in the century after the fall of Constantinople, became the dominant power in the Muslim world and in the Eastern Mediterranean, that the crescent came to be associated in Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, with Islam itself, even though it's actually a symbol of the Ottoman state. And that was partly because the Ottomans were pushed so hard, like, this is our destiny, this is the justification for us attacking these people, constantly expanding, is because we're uniting both worlds, the East and the West, under the banner of Islam, under our rule. We are, the single, they claim to be caliphs at different points, they were essentially for their time, and this sounds loaded, but they were the Islamic State of the time. At least that's what they aspired to be.
Yeah, and I think they definitely achieved that at a certain point, and for a certain period of time. But so, not to linger too long on the Ottomans, but what do you think it was, Joe, about them in particular that made them expand and gain in power so much? Because we think about Anatolia, it kind of had been a battleground for not just the Byzantines and different Turkish groups, but also different Turkish groups fighting each other. So it's really kind of remarkable that we have this one group that kind of was able to gain this precedence. So what do you think about that?
Well, I sometimes see them a little bit like the Normans in their just a little bit more unified. Well, a lot more unified. They had definitely an adventuring spirit. Like that was how you won glory and honor. That was how you won material wealth, was plunder, by booty, but it was like expanding and winning the favor of the Sultan. They saw this in as a mission to conquer the world for their Sultan, the mission to conquer the world for the Prophet, for God, and of course they attracted a lot of people who were just in it for the plunder. That was probably the majority, but they were never content to just sit around and rest on their laurels. At least they weren't until after 1683.
Well, and it's interesting too, Joe. I think another thing you can add to them, sort of similar to the Normans of the 11th and 12th centuries. Militarily, they were very adaptive. In fact, they were very. You could even say they were innovative for their time.
Clearly,
in fact, there were. They didn't have the problems. They didn't suffer from the sort of military stagnation that many of the other Islamic powers of the time suffered under. They didn't have just one shtick. They kind of learned from almost everybody they came in contact with, and they were able to adapt tactically and strategically to deal with various enemies that fought in very different ways. In fact, the Battle of Nicosia in 1391 very I think very aptly demonstrates that, in that they were able to take on a very large, very imposing Western army, and defeat it through some very unconventional means, predominantly by use of dismounted infantry in a defensive position, with supported by archers and stakes and field fortifications. Something that would be seen later that you saw with like the military innovations of the English during the 100 Years' War. So I think that's another thing that really contributed to the Ottomans' success, was just how adaptive they were.
Yeah. Okay. So that's some good stuff. So Joe, did you want to talk a little bit about Byzantium at this point? You know, what's going on there?
Well, okay. So, like I said, around the after the all right. So there is a bit of a misconception that the Fourth Crusade kind of ended, ended Byzantium, and that it was all downhill from there. To a certain extent,
damn you, Stephen Runciman.
To a certain extent, that's true, because obviously they're, like, it was divided into several different states for about 60 years. Then they got back together. But there was really a century there from 1260, early 1260s, when they recaptured Constantinople, and the 1350s, where they were again the dominant power in the region. They ruled. There may have been a kind of a sifting sea of alliances that they were dealing with, but certainly everything revolved around Constantinople. They had millions of people in the empire, but unfortunately in 1346, as we all know, the Black Death began in Kaffa, came through Constantinople and made its way to Italy and then the rest of Western Europe. Constantinople lost half of its population during that time. It went from somewhere in, and Constantinople was not just the city itself, but the suburbs across the Bosphorus, in the areas around Constantinople on the European side. There were close to 1 million people. They lost 50% of the population, and many more dispersed into the countryside to escape the plague. Into that vacuum, the Ottomans came. And so Constantinople, simultaneously, the Ottomans, who had been much more diffuse and didn't suffer such devastating losses to the plague, the Ottomans came into that vacuum, and Constantinople itself declined in population from a high of about 1 million and more in its suburbs. In the suburbs, like at the time of the 1204 sack of Constantinople, the Fourth Crusade, there was close to 1 million people in Constantinople and its suburbs, or nearabouts. But by the time that the Ottomans were in charge, around 1400, there was probably less than 100,000 people. And by the time of the fall of Constantinople in 1453, there was about 50,000 people left in the city. That put it on the same level as large Italian city-states or Paris. So it was a big city still, but it was 50,000 people hanging out in a place that was designed for 1 million. Nevertheless, they did have hundreds of thousands elsewhere. Most notably, they controlled the Peloponnesus, so where Sparta is, that part of Greece. They controlled that. That was the Despotate of Morea, and their main capital down there was right next to Sparta, a city called Mistra. Sometimes called Sparta in the records because it was so close. But effectively at 1453, the only thing that the Byzantines controlled, or at least the Paleologan emperor controlled, was Constantinople itself, a few little islands nearby, and the Peloponnesus, so South Greece. South Greece, that Peloponnesian Peninsula, was protected across the little isthmus that kind of connects it to the mainland, with a 6-mile wall, the Hexamillion. And that actually was a pretty effective defense for about 50 years, until the Ottomans presaging what happened later at Constantinople, brought up cannons in the 1440s, destroyed large sections of the wall, and burst through. They left that in Byzantine hands, but in the early 1440s, they made the Byzantine emperor a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. So Byzantium had been reduced from the dominant power in the area in the early 1300s to in the early 1400s or the mid 1400s, having about the power of a good-sized Italian state, probably less than Venice, maybe about Genoa. And they were, and of course, in a position to be technically vassals to the Ottomans, to the Turks. There was definitely some interesting things happening, though, in that time. Constantine XI took power as the Byzantine emperor in the 1440s. He's an interesting guy. Of course, his name is Constantine, which, I mean, the city's named Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It's, of course, named after the famous first Christian emperor in the 300s, Constantine the Great. Constantine the Great, whose mother was Helena. Constantine XI, his mother was Helena as well. She was a Serbian princess. He was a pretty competent guy. He was a professional soldier. He wasn't interested much in commerce or trade. He had actually broken out of the Peloponnesus when he had been in charge of that before he became emperor. Reconquered Athens and several other cities in the Greek peninsula before the Ottomans came down and put a stop to that. His people liked him. He was well respected by the nobles and the commoners. He was considered just to be a solid guy. And at this point in 1453, when the Muslims showed up, he was 49 years old. He'd been married a couple times, but had never had a son. So the empire really was kind of in a bit of a tricky position. There was no succession that was clearly visible. And there was a lot of disunion among the Greeks themselves. So there were many Greeks, of course, who were not part of the Byzantine Empire, most of whom were subjects of the Ottomans, but some of whom were parts of other Greek empires, the Empire of Trebizond, ruled by the Komnenoi, and many who were in these kind of like Italian-Greek hybrid colonies, like on Chios, that was technically a Genoese place. Many Greeks out there, but they all kind of looked to the emperor as their leader, at least kind of morally. And of course, they also looked to Constantinople for religious authority. Now, the Patriarch of Constantinople was not like the Pope, didn't have the final say on religious matters, but the Patriarch and the Emperor, Constantine's older brother John, had a decade earlier negotiated with the Western Church at the Council of Florence to bring the Western and the Eastern churches back together. So in 1439, 14 years before the fall of Constantinople, the Eastern and the Western churches actually did officially reunite. Unfortunately, at least officially as far as the emperor and the patriarch were concerned, unfortunately, because the patriarch and the emperor don't have the same authority that the Pope does in the Western Church, in the Latin Church, many Greeks did not recognize that. So there was debate in the Greek Church about the question of union, whether or not they should be united to the Pope. As far as Constantine XI was concerned, and as far as the Patriarch of Constantinople was concerned, when the Turks showed up in 1453, they were all part of the same church and no longer schismatic. So they had actually technically united. Now, many of the people, the local Greeks, did not accept that, but technically united after 1439 at the Council of Florence. So it's a kind of an odd situation where the emperor doesn't have a lot of actual direct power, but he has a lot of moral authority. Like all Greeks all over the area, all over the Aegean, even in Asia Minor, there are people who have lands, people who are Byzantine subjects who have lands in Turkish territory, or homes there, or their allegiances can be split. They had very close ties to Serbia. Constantine's mother was a Serb. His father, or her father, his grandfather, was also a Constantine. He was the Serbian Tsar. There was a lot of so there. You could imagine a situation where things could turn around very quickly, given the right circumstances, but very precarious for the Byzantines at that point.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what was going on there. It seemed like every time I was unmuting my microphone, I was getting feedback. Okay, that's some good stuff, Joe. So that's kind of some background for Byzantium at this point. Now, Joe, talk to us a little bit about the background surrounding the Ottomans' plan to take Constantinople.
All right. So I think I'm getting a little.
I'm not hearing anything, but
Okay.
Yeah, I hear a little bit on my end.
Okay, Joe. Yeah, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and talk about that.
All right. So 1 second. So, the background to the Ottoman plan to take Constantinople. The Ottomans had their eyes on it for quite some time, but for the previous 2 or 3 decades, they'd really figured that having the Byzantines as a subservient or vassal or at least inferior state was just fine, and they didn't need to have to actually go after Constantinople itself. It was widely considered to be the most heavily defended city in the Western world, so for them, the known world, and the previous Sultan, Murad II. Murad had been a pretty tolerant guy when it came to Christians and the Byzantines. He was willing to work with people. He had actually tried to take Constantinople at the beginning of his reign in 1422, failed, and just never tried again. As long as the Byzantines would occasionally pay some tribute to the Ottomans, Murad was fine with them just going about their business. Now, Murad had a son, and Murad's son was not the same sort of person as he was. His son, Mehmet, Muhammad, the Turkish version, Mehmet, Mehmet was the son of a slave woman from Serbia, probably, although some people claim that she was Frankish. And he was not really ever supposed to be the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. It's just that all his older brothers died before he got to the throne, before his father retired. His father, gave up the throne. He, as I said, he probably just kind of got old and got tired. He was a lot more tolerant to the Byzantines. But when Mehmet took over at the age of 19 in 1451, so this 19-year-old takes control of the largest state in the area, he definitely had other ideas. He was a very highly educated guy, just always seemed to be kind of pissed off. When people would, you didn't want to give him bad news, or impalements might follow. He, like I said, he was an educated guy. He was, I can't tell if he tried to be devout as a Muslim or not, but he certainly, reveled in the role of being the head of the Islamic faith in the area.
This is the guy who fought with Vlad the Impaler, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Is that where Vlad learned some of his impaling ideas?
Yeah, actually.
Okay, carry on.
So he took over at the age of 19. Had always seemed to have a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, probably because his mom was a slave. And as soon as he took over, he definitely had his eye on Constantinople. Not because he needed to have it, but because his pride would not allow him to have this just other power in the middle of his empire, just literally in between the east and west of his domains. and because they, the Constantine, the emperor in Constantinople, could claim to be the Roman emperor, going back to Augustus, and he wanted that for himself. He wanted to be in control of as the Muslims saw it, the greatest city of Christendom. He wanted to be in control of the capital of the Roman Empire, and he wanted to be the emperor of Rome. He wanted to be the Caesar. In fact, when he ended up conquering Constantinople, he did take that title for himself, Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome, the emperor of the Romans. So as a prestige matter, this 19-year-old, 20-year-old, and then 21-year-old, when he finally attacked, this guy wanted that title, wanted that position, wanted to have his capital in that place. So that's probably the biggest reason why he attacked Constantinople, not for economic or military reasons, but really for the prestige of being able to call himself the Roman emperor. Mehmet also, he was a heavy drinker, so not necessarily in line with Muslim teachings there. He also, his personal preference was boys of the 13, 14, 15 age. Although he did have plenty of kids, so
Wow.
yeah. So he in his personal life would not have been considered the most virtuous of Muslims, I suppose. But anyway, he basically he engineered this. He kind of trumped up some reasons to attack Constantinople, and some just they're not paying the proper tribute. Oh, these they're building up walls, which is a sign of war. So in 1452, he responded to what he claimed was Byzantine aggression by building a fort called the Throat Cutter, a fort in the Bosphorus north of Constantinople that could prevent ships from coming down the Bosphorus, using cannons to sink any ships that would not stop and pay the toll. Of course, that had been traditionally like where Constantinople got all its money, was people stopping to pay tolls at Constantinople. So it was a direct threat to the empire. And then in 1452, Constantine XI started to send out messages to Western Europe, especially to the Pope, pleading for help from Western Europe. And the Pope Nicholas responded. He was very concerned. Pope Nicholas was very concerned. He wanted to hang on to the gains that they had made at the Council of Florence, uniting officially the Eastern and Western churches, and wanted to win over the rest of the Greeks by sending help and showing them that 1204 was an aberration, that the Pope really did care about the Christians everywhere, that he actually did try to get the Latins to assist the Byzantines, and many of them started talking about it. In Burgundy, Philip the Good started, talking about sending people. In Venice, they started debating it. Genoa, they actually did send a few ships, 3 ships, with supplies and men. And
actually, there was a pretty sizable contingent of Italians who fought there. They usually the estimates that I've seen are usually fall in somewhere around just shy of a third.
Yeah, so 2,000 out of
the forces in Constantinople.
Yeah, 2,000 out of the total of 7,000 were Italian.
Yeah,
but most of those were already there, or already in the Greek region. The most of the Italians who set out, and there actually were many more who set out, didn't get there in time, because no one expected it to happen as fast as it did, really. So yeah, the Ottomans' plan. The background of this, basically, Mehmet wanted Constantinople for his personal prestige, and the Latin response was to
back again.
Sorry, was that?
I can hear you, Joe. You're good.
Okay.
I think, yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's you're kind of discussing the planning the Ottomans made. That's kind of our background for that. Are we ready to
Right.
move on to the Byzantine response to that, or did you have any other comments about the Ottoman plans, Joe?
Well, really, they
What is that noise?
so
Okay, I'm going to mute my microphone and you continue.
all right. Actually, I think that might be the cause. I'm sorry. So the Byzantine response to that, they took this as an existential threat. Constantine XI had fought the Ottomans before at the Hexamilion when he was in charge of the Peloponnesus. He was, as I said, a competent professional soldier. He knew what was happening. He knew that this kid was serious. His advisors knew that this was serious. George Francis, his secretary, records how the Emperor of Trebizond, another kind of semi-Byzantine state, thought, "Oh, isn't it great that Murad died?" And Francis thinks he's ridiculous because look at this new guy, Mehmet II. He's clearly going to try to do something because he's this kid with a chip on his shoulder. And so desperately, the Byzantines started sending for aid. Now, they had a couple of problems. They did have substantial holdings in Greece, so they did control the entire south of Greece. Unfortunately, and they had thousands of men there. Unfortunately, they couldn't get their men from the south of Greece, from the Peloponnesus, to Constantinople because the Ottomans attacked or at least blockaded them and occasionally attacked them. During that whole period, they just couldn't get their men up to get to the city. And because of that throat cutter fort that was built north of Constantinople, Italians from Kaffa and other cities that were Italian held, Genoese or Venetian held in the Black Sea couldn't come down to reinforce them from the north. So the Byzantines, looking pretty desperate for them, they started kind of calling in everyone from all over the place, all over the Aegean Sea, to come and support the city. Unfortunately, the Byzantines realized that they really didn't have too many people in the city who were capable of fighting. Most of the fighting men were actually stuck in the Peloponnesus, and or off on different islands. They didn't have much of a fleet left that could actually go to pick up men or run blockades or things like that. And they relied very heavily on the Italians, the Genoese, and the Venetians in particular, for their naval support. So their response there was essentially just to ask for aid. The Italians certainly started to prepare to aid Constantinople. Other Europeans started to talk about it. Aragon, in particular, the Kingdom of Aragon, started to talk about it. Unfortunately, Aragon was feuding with Genoa at the time, and also Aragon was engaged in the final years of the Reconquista. So they were, they were a little out of reach. And so Constantine XI was really just left to kind of make do with what he had, which was to start to rebuild the walls. They had been mostly rebuilt, but to reinforce them, and actually brought them up to a pretty good standard. These walls that were literally 1,000 years old, the Theodosian walls, and to try to prepare for what he knew was going to be an inevitable Ottoman assault.
Okay, so let's talk now a little bit about the actual assault. When did that begin, Joe?
So the Ottoman. I think when there you go. When the Ottomans actually started planning this and started making very hostile actions was 1452, but it wasn't until April of 1453 that the army and navy of the Ottomans under Mehmet II arrived. So April 6th is technically the beginning of the attack. But it began with the Ottomans assembling a pretty large fleet, about 100 to 150 ships of varying sizes, triremes, biremes, galleys, sloops, and things of that sort. these were things that the Ottomans had never been good sailors, and they really were having a hard time getting Greeks and others to make ships for them. So these were not necessarily very good quality, but there were a lot of them. So they came along, and they're advancing on Constantinople. At the same time, the Ottomans were coming from their European capital of Adrianople, Edirne, from the west to the east. So the Ottoman army is actually coming from the west towards Constantinople. Now, this was not a surprise. This was definitely not a surprise. For one thing, there was this guy, a Hungarian cannon maker called Urban, who had showed up the previous year in Constantinople and offered his services to Constantine the 11th, saying, "Hey, I'll build you this gigantic cannon." This was this decade specifically was a time when cannons, very large cannons, were being built all across Europe. Mons Meg in Scotland is another example of a huge cannon that was built at this time. It still exists, and it's like the official cannon of Scotland. It's massive. You can climb in it yourself. This guy Urban shows up and he says, "I'll build you a big cannon, or I'll build you several cannons." But Constantine just didn't have the money for it. He was planning his defense, but he just didn't have the money to pay for, huge new cannons. So Urban, being the good Christian that he was, he turned around and went to the Sultan and said, "Hey, will you pay me to build a huge cannon?" And Mehmet was definitely flush with cash, and he wanted what he wanted. He was 20, and he said, "Yeah, give me the biggest cannon you can make." And so this guy built the biggest cannon in the world, literally the biggest cannon in the world, for hundreds of years.
I believe in Constantinople today, or Istanbul, unfortunately. I think there's a Turkish military park that has a replica of the Dardanelles gun. That many believe is
the Dardanelles gun itself is a kind of a replica of this cannon. It was built not too long after that, but yeah. So it's not the Dardanelles gun itself, but because I think that it's believed that the cannon that Urban built or assembled right then actually did melt down sometime right at the end of the siege. Yep. But but it's pretty close. So it's this massive cannon. It weighed tons. It could, according to Niccolo Barbaro, one of the Venetian observers, fire a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile, which is that's insane. 1,200 pounds over a mile for the time. And this cannon was assembled about 100 miles away at Urban's Forge, and had to be dragged that 100 miles to Constantinople. There were 200 men that were sent out to level roads and strengthen bridges and everything, in the path of this gun and the rest of the guns that they brought. There's more than one gun. There was lots of guns, but this was the biggest. And 200 oxen were recruited to actually haul this thing. So the Byzantines saw these guys coming 100 miles off. This was months in coming, but the actual investment of the city didn't occur until early April of 1453. So the Ottomans brought a lot more than cannons, though. They had a whole range of military options. Of course, they had famously the Janissaries. This word meaning the new soldiers, the young soldiers. The Janissaries were the core of the Ottoman army. These guys were taken as children from Christian homes in the Balkans, taken as children and dragged off to serve the Sultan. They were raised as devout Muslims. They were absolutely, at this time, later on they became pretty decadent, but at this time they were absolutely fanatical. They were the personal guard of the emperor, of the Sultan, who was later become the emperor, and they were trained from an early age to be professional soldiers. They're kind of like the new model army. They're not like anything else that exists at that time. They're the inspiration for the Unsullied, actually, in Game of Thrones, because they weren't eunuchs, but they weren't allowed to have families. They were slaves. They were taken from their families as young children. So there's, you can see some similarities there to that Game of Thrones unsullied army. But those guys, the Janissaries, they made up probably about 5,000 to 10,000 men of this army that was brought before the walls of Constantinople. And of course, they were the best. But the rest of the army, which is probably about 80,000 men, probably another 80,000 support staff and engineers and, cooks and camp followers and what have you, but probably 80,000 men that were actually brought to bear on Constantinople. The rest of them were a combination of spahis, these kind of the Turkish equivalent of a knight, these landed gentlemen who were, who were horsemen. They supplied their own arms and armor based on the revenues of their fiefs. Spahis were there. They also had azabs. That's kind of like just regular infantry troops. They're a combination of missile and spearmen. And then finally these Bashi bazooks. So Bashi bazook, if you ever read Tintin, like those comics as a child, Tintin, it's that Captain Haddock, the sea captain, Tintin's friend, is always shouting Bashi bazooks at people as a term of imprecation. Bashi bazook literally means broken in the head. These guys were people who were just drawn from all over just scrounged up from all over the Ottoman Empire. They weren't regularly paid. They were just there, and the only time they actually got paid, they were given supplies and armor and weapons by the Ottoman Sultan, but the only time they were actually paid is when they took a city. So these guys had no discipline whatsoever. That's why they're called, crazy heads, damage in the head. And the only motivation they had for fighting was plunder, was rape and plunder. So Janissaries, super disciplined and fanatical. Spahis, knights. The azabs, just kind of regular soldiers, and then finally the Bashi bazooks, the crazy heads who are there just kind of waste their lives, and if they happen to take the city, then that's when they get their pay. So that was the force that was brought to bear on Constantinople. 80,000 of this mixed force that was brought there in April 1453.
Okay, so yeah, that's pretty disappointing that we've got an Italian engineer here who's making the
Hungarian
cannon. Oh, okay, Hungarian. And he's making the massive cannon that's going to be used against this great Christian city. Man, that's that's too bad. Okay, good description there of the army and everything, Joe. 80,000. So that would have been just an incredibly large force for the time, right, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure Rand. Can you tell us what they're the large forces in the 100 Years' War? Like how big?
I mean, probably the largest army you ever saw in the field for the 100 Years' War was probably the army that Edward III brought for his what was intended to be his Reims and Paris campaign, which was in 1359. And that number just shy of 100,000. So it's kind of in the 90,000s, but it was considered. I mean, that was getting some feedback.
Sorry, Rand. Yeah, go ahead.
That was considered very unusual. And I mean, typically your standard English army was usually around the 5,000 to 6,000 frame, and then the French were usually just slightly larger than that, usually kind of in the 7, 8 to maybe 9,000 at the largest. So although of course there were exceptions, so the French at Agincourt were supposed to have had around probably 15 to 20,000, but and Poitiers was probably pretty similar, but yeah, I mean these are numbers that you do not typically see in the period.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's move on now, Joe. Talk to us about how the Byzantines defended against this attack.
Okay. So the Byzantines, they had a few men who were in charge of the defense. Emperor Constantine, of course, being on top. Constantine, he knew what he was doing. He was a professional soldier, but he was joined by some other pretty capable guys. He had his cousin Theophilus Paleologus, who was a mathematician. He was a knight and a mathematician, which I love. And he was, he was pretty much an expert when it came to defense. But there was also a little bit a more flamboyant guy, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. Giovanni Giustiniani.
I always thought it was funny. We talked about the fact that the last emperor was a Constantine. I thought it was funny that on the Italian side there was another guy who had another name that harkened back to the Eastern Roman tradition, and that was Justinian.
Yeah. So exactly, and that's who he was named after. So Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. Yeah, and so Justiniani, as he is mostly known, he was a Genoese, but he was also a Byzantine subject. He ruled over the island of Chios, and he was a young guy. He was 35 at the time of this siege, and he was considered the foremost expert in defending against artillery of anyone in the area. He came sailing into Constantinople with 700 Greeks and Genoese from Chios, and was put in charge of kind of the liaison between the different groups, the Greeks, the Genoese, the Venetians. There had been a bunch of Italians that who had successfully sailed out of the city a couple months before this. It was considered a betrayal. It negotiated so that the Venetians would actually turn their sails into the city so that they couldn't leave. And the Venetians were fine with it. The Venetians did quite well with this. Of course, he being a Genoese, he didn't ask his fellow Genoese to turn their sails in. So he was a competent guy, very charismatic. People liked him. People liked to follow him. He's a great natural leader, as far as we can tell. So we have Justiniani kind of leading the Italians, Constantine leading the whole force. In charge of all the Greeks was a guy called Lucas Notaras. Lucas was an older guy. He seems pretty crusty to me. He seems pretty solid. His part of the wall was never breached. He survived the battle and was only executed by Mehmet later. Three main leaders, I would say, Constantine, Justiniani, and Lucas, leading the Greek and Italian forces. There was about 5,000 Greeks, of whom only 3,000 could be considered soldiers in any way. They they scoured the city for all the men they could find. Unfortunately, a bunch of men had fled before the Ottomans arrived. So Constantine was expecting to have 10,000 Greeks there. But a lot of people left with their families before the Ottomans arrived, not surprisingly, but unfortunately. And about 2,000 Italians, or not just Italians, but there was a company of Catalans, not the Catalan company, but people from Spain and other areas. The Pope had sent a few ships months earlier. And there were a couple of actual cardinals who were in the city with a few hundred men of their own. So 7,000 defenders of Constantinople against at least 80,000 Turkish soldiers on the outside. Now, at the time, they put the numbers on the Turkish side somewhere between 160,000 and 300,000. But while we think that there were probably that many Turks there, probably only 80,000 of them were soldiers. So the Byzantines, they had 14 miles of wall all around the city. So about 6 miles on the landward side. So that's not too bad, 6 miles on the landward side. Of course, if you haven't seen Constantinople, it is essentially a triangle peninsula that juts out into the Sea of Marmara, in between the Black and the Mediterranean seas. And the land walls were built in the 400s by the Emperor Theodosius. They had been strengthened recently by Constantine and his older brother, and they were in pretty good shape, to be honest. The sea walls on the southern side of the peninsula, no one could really attack those because the currents were too strong. No one could really get a ship to stay close enough without slamming into the side of the walls. So they didn't really have to worry too much about the sea walls. That's where they put the monks, who technically couldn't fight. They could just kind of push ladders or alert real soldiers. On the north side, that's where the harbor was, and they called it the Golden Horn. The Golden Gate in San Francisco is named after it because it has a similar look. But the Golden Horn, and to block off the Golden Horn, block off the harbor from the Turkish fleet, the Byzantines extended a chain floating on logs from the walls of the city itself to the land on the far side of the harbor, and attach it to the walls there. The walls on the little town on the other side, this town called Pira or Galata, Greek or Italian. The walls of Pira. Pira was controlled by the Genoese, and they were officially neutral. So the Sultan didn't want to start a war with Genoa at the time, so he did not attack Pira directly. So he couldn't take down the boom, take down the chain blocking off the harbor. So he couldn't send his fleet into the harbor at first without breaking the neutrality with Genoa. So you have a chain across the harbor, so the fleet can't come in and can't therefore attack the seawalls to the north. The seawalls to the south are basically, you can't get to them because of the currents. So it's that 6 miles of wall on the landward side that those 7,000 guys have to defend. Now, Ducas, the Byzantine chronicler, says basically that every tower around the whole city, which is 14 miles of walls. 14 miles of walls is a lot. 14 miles of walls. Every tower had, except in certain areas, had just one archer or gunner. So one guy with a little arquebus or something of the kind, or one guy with a crossbow, sitting up there to, let people know if there's going to be an attack. But for the most part, the Byzantine forces were arrayed on the landward side, and in particular at this one little area where a stream, the Lycus River, passes underneath the walls of the Theodosian walls into the city. The Lycus River goes through there. That was the weakest area of the walls because of this stream. It was right in the middle, and there's several gates nearby, and that's where the Ottoman attack was going to be focused. So that's where most of those 7,000 men were stationed. So probably about 3 or 4,000 men actually manning the walls at any given time. 3,000, 2 or 3,000 of them would be in the Lycus Valley area, so right in the middle of the land walls.
Okay, so pretty dramatic difference there in terms of forces. We've got overwhelming force from the Ottomans and pretty minimal defense capabilities from the Byzantines. So
yeah, I mean, it's anywhere from 10 to 20 times the numbers. Yeah, but again, remember the people in Western Europe really were not too concerned, or they were concerned, but they were thinking, oh, they'll really just need supplies, because Constantinople had such a reputation as just an untakeable city. It was really just an accident in 1204 that and some unrest in the city itself, disunion in the city itself, that led to the Crusaders or the Venetians taking the city in 1204. It was considered in the rest of Europe to be essentially unconquerable. So
right. So let's talk about the actual fall of the city. How did the Ottomans actually take control of the city? How did the city actually fall, Joe?
Oh my gosh, it's really dramatic. So it took place over this siege took place over the course of 53 days. So from April 6th to May 29th. So April 6th, and their Italian allies were pretty hopeful. The fleet showed up outside the boom, outside the chain. They couldn't get in. There's nothing they could do there. The Ottoman army showed outside the land walls. They couldn't get in. There's nothing they could do there. They began shelling the place very heavily with many guns, dozens of guns. There was one big one, but there was also some pretty substantial other ones as well. But Justiniani being, the expert wall defender that he was, he organized a defense that even if certain parts of the wall would fall, they would be quick to bring up repairs. Wine barrels filled with dirt or rocks or things like that. Stack those up. Actually, layer them on top with wicker shields. Is actually it's almost like Vauban. It's much better defense than a masonry wall. So even like the walls if they would get shorter, they would actually be more resistant to cannon fire after they were brought down than when they started. I should say, for anyone who doesn't know, the land walls of Constantinople are absurd. At first, as you approach the city, there's a trench. It's more than a trench, a moat, but it would never be filled with water. About 15 feet deep, 60 feet across. And at the far end of that, there'd be a little 9-foot high kind of like outer parapet where people could kind of like keep people from getting it up over the moat. And that itself would be enough for your passing horse lord band. But beyond that would be the main walls, or the outer walls, I should say, not the main walls. And those were about 15 feet high with towers interspersed between them. And behind those 15 to 20 foot high walls were 40 foot high walls with 60 foot high towers in them. So you can kind of imagine Minas Tirith as the inspiration or as being inspired by Constantinople, this successive layers of higher and higher walls that had lasted for 1,000 years. Those walls themselves had never been forced. When the Crusaders took Constantinople in 1204, they came over the sea walls on the Golden Horn, which were much smaller, and you had to bring ships up against. So these walls were, until the advent of cannon, impregnable, this wall system. Unfortunately, the defenders didn't have enough men to man all 3 layers of walls. They had to choose the middle layer of walls, with some support from the higher walls behind them with some archers or gunners. So, and of course, the weak points were the many gates that cut their way through these main things. So, the Ottomans couldn't bring up like siege towers or anything like that because of that main moat that was there. That was 60-foot wide moat that was in the way. The defenders being able to shower missiles down on them whenever they saw something approaching. But still, it's 6 miles of wall at the best that you have to defend with a pretty small force. 10 times fewer men. Let's see. Okay. Remind me of the question.
Yeah, we were talking about the actual fall of Constantinople,
yes, okay.
How the Ottomans actually took the city.
So there was shelling day and night reported by Nicola Barbaro. Shelling day and night. So the big cannon could only fire once every 4 hours, but they would do it they'd do it as many times as they could, 6 to 8 times a day, firing a 1,000-pound ball against the walls, plus many other cannons. Now they would shell from all sorts of different areas. They from across the Golden Horn, from just trying to do whatever they could to destroy, bring down the walls as much as they could. The defenders were engaged in this 2-month-long struggle to rebuild the walls every night as the walls came down. So that's what most of the siege looked like. There were several major assaults, which resulted in most cases with very few Christian casualties and very heavy Ottoman casualties.
Mhm.
For one thing, the Christians had excellent armor at the time. This is 1453. The best armor in the world was made in Italy. These guys were Italians, and Italian allies, so they had access to really good armor. So as defenders, this was their advantage. And while the Janissaries, about 10,000 of the Sultan's troops were very heavily armored and probably the equal of the Christian armor, the majority of the Ottoman troops were not. So whenever they would assault the walls, Christians would beat them back. The Ottomans and Turks and their allies would suffer heavy losses. And
yeah, I know David Nicole, in his book on the fall of Constantinople, he kind of gives he advances the idea that it's kind of a misconception that the fall of Constantinople was a foregone conclusion.
Right, I don't think
that and if you read the sources, I mean, the Christians held out very well, considering the circumstances, and they really did make the Ottomans bleed for every inch that they took. It was by no means a pushover.
Yeah, definitely not. In fact, actually, I do love this one story. So 3 Genoese ships in the early days of the siege arrived at the city. They had been there to coming to supply the city. They were expecting to find it. They did not expect to find it under siege yet. How quickly the Ottomans got there did take the Italians by surprise. But they made their way to the city. And as they were approaching, within sight, the whole Ottoman fleet goes off after them, and so these 3, and then joined by a 4th ship, get almost to the walls of Constantinople, and they're blown back off course, and suddenly they're surrounded by dozens of Ottoman ships. Now the Ottoman ships were a lot smaller. The Christian ships were huge in comparison, with big forecastles and aft castles, and the sailors on them wearing much heavier Italian armor, or at least much better Italian armor. And after an entire day of trying to get into Constantinople, finally we're to the point where Mehmet, the Sultan, actually everyone's been watching this from the top of the Hippodrome, which is at that time it still existed, although it was in disrepair. Citizens were climbing all the way up to this 150-foot tall structure to watch this battle happening on the waves outside the city, and just surrounded by dozens of ships. They finally break through, and just the sheer size of the walls on their ships, the quality of their armor, they're much better seamen. They were able to make it through with minimal casualties, a few wounds, maybe a couple deaths, depends on the source. And anywhere from 500 to thousands of Ottoman casualties on the seas as they break into the city. It was just, the Ottomans were certainly outclassed on the sea. One major thing, though, that turned the tide for the Ottomans was the fact that the Genoese of Pira remained neutral. And while they were shipping supplies to Constantinople constantly across the Golden Horn, so remember they were friendly, and obviously they clearly wanted the Byzantines to win, but they couldn't antagonize the Sultan. At least they couldn't start a war on behalf of Genoa with the Sultan until the Genoese fleet officially got there. They didn't tell the city when the Sultan, in the dead of night, and in a really incredible engineering feat, brought about a quarter of his fleet overland from the Sea of Marmara, past Pira, down the hill, on these rollers and logs and stuff, into the Golden Horn. So they brought a large part of the Turkish fleet into the Golden Horn, into the harbor, which meant that now they could threaten the sea walls, and they extended the area that the Byzantines had to defend by 7 miles. Well, maybe not quite that much, but by several miles at least. and were able to prevent Pyrrha and the Genoese from sending supplies to Constantinople anymore. So this thing that happened in the dead of night, that the Genoese did not warn the Byzantines about, that they were able to kind of steal a march on them. So that meant that at the beginning of May, so a month into the siege, now the Byzantines had to defend not just the 6 miles of land wall, but the whole northern sea wall, from the area, the region that the Crusaders had crossed over to get into the city in 1204. So that made a big difference. And then it does seem like before that point, the city could probably have held out as long as the supplies held out. But after that, they stretched the defenders so thin, and at a much more vulnerable point in the wall, that it was much trickier for May than it had been in April. Now, so there's this constant bombardment. They're gradually increasing the leaguer around the city by getting into the Golden Horn, getting into the harbor, extending the area that the Byzantines have to defend. But still not a foregone conclusion. The Byzantines actually sent out a ship, go look for the Venetian fleet, the Venetian fleet that we hear is coming. There was hope. But as things wore down towards the end of May, and as more and more walls started to crumble, and more casualties started to mount, it was looking worse and worse. So right at the end of May, so the last week of May is when things really got hot. There had been a couple major assaults before, like where almost the entire Ottoman army had attacked the land walls, been repulsed with heavy losses, very few losses for the Byzantines and Italians. But at the last week of May, they started to discover Ottoman mines underneath the walls. They started countermining. The Ottomans really wanted to fill in the moat so they could bring siege engines across. And they started to be pretty successful in getting parts of the moat filled in. And they were just exhausting the defenders. Now, the defenders, of course, there's many fewer men. So when you're talking about mining and countermining, you got to have a certain percentage of men on the walls in order to defend against an assault. You can't have them constantly countermining and just digging in the dirt. Whereas the Ottomans had not just 80,000 soldiers, but probably another many more thousands, tens of thousands of men just kind of there, slaves to dig holes and try to fill in ditches and things like that. So they were getting more and more exhausted. They were starting to not really run out of food, but it was stretched. There was also at least 30,000 civilians in the city to feed. Never mind the 7,000 soldiers. So it was starting to look more and more hopeless. But still, at the very end of May, on the 27th of May, actually, the Ottomans almost gave up. Mehmet had a council because he had been hearing a lot of rumblings in his camp. His father's old guard, who never really wanted to go to war with the Byzantines in the first place, were starting to complain. Well, we've lost thousands and thousands of men, attacking the walls. We've lost so many ships. Just trying to look, those 3 or 4 Genoese ships, sank a whole bunch of us, killed thousands of us as they got into the city. What happens if, the Genoese or the Venetians actually show up with a real fleet? What'll that do to our navy? And once our navy's gone, then there's no point even attacking the land walls, because they could just bring in reinforcements and supplies all the time. So Mehmet had to really fight to get his generals to agree. And so he decided on, finally, the only way we're going to do this is we're going to try this all at one time. It's going to be do or die. So on May 29th, they settled on a final assault that would decide whether or not they were going to take Constantinople, or if they're going to leave. So May 29th is the day. Began early in the morning, sometime after midnight. Niccolo Barbaro says it's about 3 hours before dawn. Others say it's a little bit, more like 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. Mehmet launches this massive assault all across the walls. The fleet attacks in the harbor, trying to get to the sea walls, and all 80,000 of the Ottoman troops attack the land walls, focusing on one main area, the Lycus Valley, where the river goes underneath the walls. Now, he started with his most worthless and again, crazy in the head troops, the Bashi Bazouks. So these are the guys who are the adventurers. They didn't get paid unless they got the city. So they were the ones who are the most fanatical about actually, taking the city. But they were also the least valuable because they could, they wouldn't really follow orders. They just not good soldiers. So he sends the Bashi Bazouks against the city. Massive assault. They throw hay bales and stuff into just dirt and rocks and everything into the moat as they're crossing. They've already filled in most of it, or in it right near the Saint Romanus Gate. As they attack there, they attack several, basically 3 places, but the Saint Romanus Gate area and the Lycus Valley is really where they concentrated their assault. And this area had been effectively. The outer wall had been destroyed by cannon fire and had been replaced by a stockade of barrels and wood and wicker. So it was pretty good at that point against cannon fire, but it was susceptible to an infantry assault. So these guys charge the thing in the dead of night, and the Byzantines and the Italians drive them off. In fact, this is where Justinian was. Justinian and the Emperor Constantine were on this this same mile of wall where they attack. Justinian and his men drive them off, and they come again, and they drive them off again. The Bashi Bazouks are spent. Their retreat. But of course, the Sultan has many more men. His Azabs, his just kind of regular Turkish troops. He sends them after them. These Anatolians. They sends them in the assault. He promises that any man who takes the first man who crosses the walls and raises the flag over the Roman fortifications will be just hugely rewarded. Basically, just raised up to a lordship. So people they're going nuts, but they're Barbaro talks about how it was obscene how many people they killed how many Turks they killed as they're trying to cross the walls. Trying to get over the moat. It's almost like the Battle of the Crater, you can imagine, in the Civil War. But of course, this is happening over the course of this night, and they're constantly sending fresh troops against the same 1,000 or so guys who are defending this section of the Byzantine wall, and they're starting to get tired. They're killing so many Turks. They're fighting. They're pushing. They're putting new barricades up, and then finally the big gun, one big shot hits somewhere along the stockade near the San Romanus Gate and knocks it down for yards on either side, just smashes the whole thing. There's a huge calamity. There's bells ringing in the city as this assault is going on, and the Ottomans start to pour through. There's about 300 that get through right after the main cannonball blasts through the stockade. They're quickly surrounded and attacked by a troop of Italians who come out of a side, a postern Kirkaporta, this one little gate. But unfortunately, after their successful sortie out of the gate, something happened. Either they were followed, or some fool forgot to close the gate, or something happened, or was chopped back down, and a bunch of Turks start going in through this postern gate, this little side gate, in a tower, and that which is left undefended after this little sortie, and all of a sudden, so there's 2 disasters that happen around the same time. It's a little bit after dawn, like sometime 7 in the morning. There's a bunch of Turks rush into this postern gate that's been left open or has been forced open, and reach the top of the tower and erect an Ottoman banner. So now all of a sudden, everyone in the area can see there are Turks on top of the wall. At right around the same time, Giovanni Giustiniani, the charismatic, Italian Genoese leader who has brought the Italians and the Venetians and the Genoese and the Greeks together, he is shot with a cannonball in the chest. So something small like a culverin, it punctures his plate mail in the chest. I have to imagine that he now has a sucking chest wound, something tension pneumothorax situation going on. And he's not thinking right because he asked to be taken away. Constantine is alerted to the fact that Justinian is being taken away. He rushes over from where he is, hundreds of yards down the wall, defending a different area. Constantine rushes over, pleads with Justinian, please don't go. We need you. You are kind of the glue. But Justinian, and this is something that the Venetians will condemn him for, and the Greeks will condemn him for, and even the Genoese cardinal who was there on the scene will kind of like shamefacedly condemn him for, decides that he has to go. Now, he dies 2 days later, so I don't know if he was really in his right mind. Like I said, he's been shot in the chest with a cannonball. But anyway, he's hauled away by his men. They open up a gate to let him through. Everyone sees him going. And so the combination of seeing their charismatic Italian leader being hauled away on a stretcher and a Turkish flag atop the walls at one point, all of a sudden, everyone starts to panic. In particular, the Greek troops, because unlike the Italians, the Greeks have all their families inside the walls. So if the walls are taken, you're a guy, your family's in there, what's going to happen. They don't drop their weapons, but they rush out of there, and they head back into the town, head back into Constantinople. There's miles and miles. There's another 6 miles to the end of the peninsula. Maybe that you can get there before the Turks do and do something about this. Get your family out. Get on an Italian ship or try to swim or something like that. People start to rush out of this San Romanus area, this gate area, leaving the gate open. Great. And leaving Emperor Constantine there with his his few remaining nobles. So this little bit. So Constantine is seeing what's happened. He's just pleaded with Justinian not to flee. Justinian does, despite this. Constantine, basically his family. So he's there with his cousin Theophilus Paleologus, the mathematician and siege expert. He's there with his much more distant cousin, the Spaniard Don Francisco, Sir Francis of Toledo, and his companion, his warrior, just a household knight, effectively, John Dalamata. And so these four guys, Theophilus is the one who kind of loses it first and just charges into the oncoming Turks. When he sees this and sees his cousin charge into the Turks, Constantine, his last recorded words, at least according to Dukas, Byzantine historian, are that the city is fallen, still alive, and spurs his horse in there, followed by Francisco and Dalmata. It said that right before he charges into the all insignia of office, he signs who he is.
Hey, Joe. Joe.
It is known that it's the emperor. Take yeah.
Joe, you're breaking up pretty significantly there.
Oh, no, okay.
What a time for it too. That's
I know, right?
Really good drama there. We're getting to the climax. Okay, so let's get that last part again.
Where was I?
I'm going to mute my microphone and we'll go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm not sure what you heard last, but Theophilus Paleologus charges into the fray. Attacks. Basically, he knows what's going to happen. And seeing this, the emperor says, "How is it that the city's fallen onto a lot?" He takes off all his insignia of rank. He loses any indication that he is the emperor, because if that it was known, then they might take him alive. And charges in and his body.
Yeah, man, we're really losing Joe.
Yeah, man.
Here, I'm going to, let's see here.
No, it's not, Joe. We can barely get you.
I'm going to eject Joe for a second, and he can come back.
Okay.
Okay. Rand, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hopefully we didn't lose too many of our viewers.
This is the perils of live broadcasting, I guess.
It is, yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, well, yeah, we really.
Hold on, bear with us, folks. We'll get Joe back on there and finish this out as soon as we can.
Yeah, we're really kind of getting pretty far in on time too. We probably are going to want to start to wrap things up, but let's get Joe in here for some final comments if we can.
I know one thing. I know not to, just in case we don't get him back. I know, and just for the benefit of everyone who is listening, the final stand of Constantine in 1453 is really an incredible story. I highly recommend everybody listening go research it, go look it up. It is kind of one of those very rare moments in history where it really was this very desperate last stand situation, and you really saw some pretty incredible heroism there near the end. It was kind of a Thermopylae esque sort of situation where all these guys knew they were going to die, and they knew they weren't going to make it out. And they went down accordingly. So
yeah, absolutely. And one thing that happened also is in those final moments, there was a mass that was offered in the Hagia Sophia by both the Latin and Greek clergy.
Yeah,
they had set aside their long-standing disagreements and the so-called schism, and were basically just acting as Christian brothers. And I think that's a pretty powerful and beautiful moment, and it's unfortunate that it had to come at that final agony of Constantinople. That's when we finally get that unity. I really think that the disunity between East and West that seemed to kind of persist and gnaw on through the centuries was really pretty petty and unnecessary in the end. And I think 1453 is kind of the fruit of that, if you will. But
it was.
I don't know. We may have lost Joe for good, so you and I may have to kind of give some closing thoughts.
Okay.
Let me see. Let me just ask him one more time.
Okay. I know it may have been he may have had connection issues.
Yeah. Is he like out in the Sahara?
He's in Virginia.
Oh, okay. So almost the wilderness. Okay. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know, but man, Joe is absolutely an encyclopedia for this topic, though. It's pretty amazing. He can just rattle off the entire history of the fall of Constantinople with very little aid whatsoever. So
yeah, he really is kind of our our Eastern Roman subject matter expert that we like to bring in. So
yeah, I don't know. He's looks like he's not making it back in. Well, maybe what we should do is just wrap things up now, and maybe some other time we can have sort of a discussion with Joe just about
yeah,
the long-term impact of the fall of Constantinople.
I know one thing that you know, and I know a lot of people were asking. I noticed in the chat and things like that was, you know, why, you know, why was the response from Western Europe so lackluster, you know, while this was going on? Why, you know, why wasn't there this relief effort that was put together despite the Pope's, you know, despite Pope Nicholas very fervently calling for it? And you really have to look at what was going on in Western Europe at the time. Western Europe was also in a the mid 15th century was an extremely dynamic period for Western Europe. You had a lot of things going on. You know, in fact, that year in 1453 was the year the 100 Years' War between England and France ended. It was, in fact, just either right about the same time as the fall of Constantinople, or just after. You had the Battle of Castillon, fought in what is now kind of the area around Bordeaux, in France, and it was the defeat of the last English army in France, and it finally ended the 117-year-long conflict that had dragged on since 1337. And the battle itself was not all that impressive, but what it marked was sort of a new era for military science in Western Europe. The Hundred Years' War changed a lot in Western Europe. It changed the way wars were fought. It changed politics. It changed societies. It changed culture. And what you saw was Europe sort of beginning to come out of what we would call the medieval period, and it was actually sort of the very, very beginnings of the early modern era, with ideas of like the nation state and you know, large national armies that, you know, primarily comprised of professionally trained commoners. You know, no longer the mounted aristocrat on horseback was no longer the premier military asset. So, you know, also gunpowder artillery was really beginning to make itself felt on the battlefields of Western Europe. In fact, the reason why the English lost the Battle of Castillon in 1453 was because the French, Gaspard and Jean Bureau, the two French, they were French brothers who basically single-handedly created the first professional artillery, field artillery park for Charles VII of France. The English army was decimated by French field artillery. So it was an extremely dynamic time for Europe, and culturally, because of that, because there was so much going on in Western Europe during that time, the East, including Constantinople, had sort of become it sort of became this thing of not totally mythical, but it sort of became this very far away place that, like, you know, everybody liked to talk about it, but very few were willing to actually go out and do anything for it. There was way too much going on way closer to home. And that's really where you see kind of the end of the crusading the crusading impulse that had defined early in the early and high medieval period. And everything became much more focused on what was going on at home. And kings became way more focused on, you know, creating these very strong national centers of power, you know, against their rivals. So things like, going off and reclaiming the Holy Land, or going off and fighting for the emperors in Constantinople, kind of became this very far away, very exotic thing that just didn't really elicit a whole lot of response anymore. And there just wasn't, and not to say that they weren't saddened by when they heard of the fall of Constantinople, but it was just one of those things where it's like, hey, look, we'll get to that when we can get to that. We'll get to that when we defeat the French, or we'll get to that when we defeat the English, or the Burgundians, or whoever. It just wasn't. It didn't have the pull that the early years of the crusading movement. It didn't have the pull that Urban II's address at Clermont in 1095 had, anymore. It just that culture was no longer, Europe was no longer that culture. It didn't have the that impulse was just not there anymore, or at least not in any real way. So it's sad. It was a very, it's sad that, when you study the history of the Crusades, and you look at, these great, these groundswell grassroots movements of, entire peoples going off to the east to go, fight for the cross, and all this kind of thing. It's sad to see that just kind of eventually kind of peter out. And you sort of have this, when word reaches of the fall of Constantinople, the vast majority of European leaders were a little bit more indifferent to it. It's sad. It's tragic, but at the same time, it doesn't take away at all from just the incredible heroics that you have at the final moments of Constantinople. And it really was this, like you said, it really was this kind of beautiful little moment where East and West, Latin and Greek, kind of came back together again. Just before the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a powerful moment, and I think that Constantine XI's heroism is, it goes without question. He just showed himself to be a leader in an impossible situation, who rose to the occasion and fought beside his people in their final tragedy. So powerful stuff. And I was just talking to Joe, and yeah, we're still having some connection issues with him. So we're just going to actually plan to have him back possibly next week, and we will discuss the actual sacking of the city, some of the stuff that Mehmed did in the aftermath of the fall of the city, and also sort of the impact historically of the fall of Constantinople. So yeah, I think that would be something fun to do, because I know that Joe has a lot to say on that topic. So you can come back for that, right, Rand?
Oh, absolutely. Great.
Well, I guess with that, this has been one of our longest live streams ever.
Yeah, it really has.
But yeah, but Joe, I knew he was going to be a really good source of just encyclopedic knowledge for this particular event. So I'm really glad we were able to have him on to go over everything, because everything you want to know about the fall of Constantinople, he can certainly deliver it. So yeah, I think Rand and I are going to go ahead and say goodnight to everybody. And we certainly appreciate everybody listening and participating in the chat and whatnot. Glad to have everybody here. And of course, a big thanks to Joe Vicinanzo from Rand and I for being our guest tonight. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and thanks for helping out with this Rand. I'll see you next time.
Absolutely, you too. Deus Vult, everybody.
Deus Vult, and we will announce when we're going to have Joe on again, so we can actually finish this story up. So, all right, thanks everybody.